Alrighty. Welcome in, everybody. The VMware User Group, or VMUG, is an independent, global, customer-led organization created to maximize members' use of VMware and partner solutions through knowledge, sharing, training, collaboration, and events. Just so you all know, this session will be recorded and sent out, so you will have access to this presentation afterward. And if you guys have questions, please use the Q&A function down below instead of the chat. It'll be a lot more smooth and seamless on our end if you use that function, and we'll be able to answer your questions. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nathan.
Hi, folks. Give me just a second to pull up my presentation here and share my screen. Let's do this first. All right. If we are not good, please let me know here. But I think we should be in pretty good shape as long as folks can see the presentation I've got up over here. Okay. Uh, but hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Montierth. I lead the threat intelligence team here at Vali Cyber. I completed my undergrad degree at United States Air Force Academy, did a little bit of cyber competition team type stuff there. And then I had a career for a couple of years working a little bit of offensive cyber with the DoD. And so some of the topics that we're going to be covering today are near and dear to my heart. The things that I saw there is honestly what led me to really get into hypervisor security and Linux security as well to some extent. And today I'm excited to be talking to you about some of the more severe threats that we're seeing against ESXi specifically and really hypervisors at large. Okay, so let's talk about it. This is probably not going to come as news to many people who are attending a VMUG event, but there have been lots of really big names that have been hit by hypervisor attacks in the last few years. I mean, we could talk about Panera, Omni Hotels, M&S, even places like MITRE, Johnson Controls, MGM, and honestly many more. So these have been both commercial and also some state and kind of government type targets as well, including like things like the Florida Supreme Court. And I mentioned MITRE before, and there's obviously a lot of government interplay with them as an organization as well. To talk a little bit about some of the specific ones, we could really briefly, I'll talk about Lockbit being one of the big names in the ransomware gang space. And they've, completed well over 1,700 attacks in the last couple of years. And then there's one really big one that I'm sure is being considered a lot right now, which is Scattered Spider. So there's been probably an estimated of over $100 billion in damage that Scattered Spider has caused. You probably heard scary stuff about some of the airlines that have been hit in just very recent months. I think Hawaiian Airlines was among them. They've kind of had a resurgence this year. So Scattered Spider they had some attacks in the early 2020s where they were going against places like the MGM attack I mentioned earlier. And then this year, we've seen kind of a resurgence after a couple of arrests happen in 2024, including organizations like UNF, the Marks and Spencer attack I mentioned as well. And then a lot of these airline attacks are also being attributed to Scattered Spider. So as we go through some of these attack vectors that I'm going to be talking about today against hypervisors, I'll be hearkening it back a little bit to Scattered Spider. And a couple of actually, in fact, the MGM attack that we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to demo a portion of what that attack would have looked like. That obviously being a Scattered Spider attack is going to be directly applicable to some of the things we talk about today with Zero Lock and how it protects against these types of things. So I'm excited to get into all of that with you guys. But before we do, let's just talk about why hypervisors, kind of where hypervisors are at currently. So there's been a little bit of a market shift in the last couple of years, considering some of the acquisitions that have happened in the hypervisor space, but we're still seeing the ESXi is one of the most used hypervisors. And attackers are really liking to go after hypervisors because there is a tremendous blast radius associated with compromising a single server. So it's one of these things where it just makes, quote unquote, financial sense for them, right? If they can spend more of their effort going against one machine and working on one set of exploits that works for that particular type of machine, and they can get all of those virtualized workloads, all of the servers that are being virtualized on top of the hypervisor, then the blast radius for a ransomware attack is much more significant, and it definitely increases the chances that they're going to receive some kind of payout from the victims. And unfortunately, there's a couple of reasons why this happens. There's a couple of ways that these attacks tend to form, and usually it's through credential compromise, misconfiguration, or vulnerability or exploiting. And I'm going to kind of refer to credential compromise also as being sort of a lateral movement, right? Because really, what that means at the end of the day is that we are able to uh, or sorry, misconfiguration is lateral movement. Because at the end of the day, what that means is, hey, we are able to get network visibility, and there's something in this network that is configured incorrectly that allows us to simply move laterally across the network. Something else I really want to highlight about ESXi is that there's no there, there's no shortage of vulnerabilities that are associated with ESXi. You'll notice on this slide that we talk about how for vulnerabilities and exploits, there are 117 that are known. And that number should be fairly accurate up into the last couple of months, but it's hard to keep that number accurate. And the reason is because we're seeing more and more CVEs that are released against ESXi pretty regularly. So for 2025 alone, in March, we had, I think, a group of three CVEs that would have been CVE 2025, 22224, 22225, and 22226 that could be essentially chained together to become a virtual machine escape. But unfortunately, even though those only came out in March, specifically against ESXi, one of the Pwn to Own conferences this year, or competitions this year, I should say, also had a couple of ESXi exploits that came out of it. And those CVEs were only released in late July, so just a couple of weeks ago. So just a couple of weeks ago, we had another grip, I think, of three or four CVEs that were released against it. Now, just the CVE existing doesn't necessarily mean that there are weaponized exploits that are ready to go against it, but that is the beginning of a weaponized exploit. You have to have a vulnerability to be able to exploit. So these are the nascent stages of exploits like that existing. And unfortunately, we're seeing that patch times for ESXi specifically kind of vary, but with those, the Pwn to Own competition itself, when those vulnerabilities were disclosed to Broadcom VMware, I think was in May, mid-May, and then we saw the CVE released alongside a patch in late July, which is great. It's good to see that patching is happening, but unfortunately, there is a period of time between the two where that vulnerability is known, that can sometimes give that small window of time for an attacker to jump in there with that exploit, assuming that they have a weaponized version of it. The other problem with ESXi, and the reason I shouldn't say too much of a problem, but the reason that attackers are really going after it is because it's not a traditionally focused on platform for security. So most folks who are concerned about security in their environments, at least traditionally over the last couple decades, have been less concerned about hypervisors and more about user workstations or maybe dev machines or perhaps email servers or web servers and the like. And the hypervisors have gone perhaps a little bit just unmonitored. And this contributes to the fact that there really haven't been good runtime security solutions for hypervisors up until now. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today is ZeroLock, which is a runtime security solution for ESXi. But this really, I think, kind of highlights why attackers are very likely focused on ESXi and hypervisors in general. One of the things that I'll sometimes hear when we talk about this is that firewalls are, I have a firewall in my environment, and this is what's protecting me. This is what's mitigating the attacks against my virtualized environment. And this is good. You should have a firewall in your environment, and it should absolutely be an important part of a complete breakfast, right? Like it should be an important part of your network security, but it's not usually enough. They're a good mitigation, but they're not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything. Lateral movement to hypervisors is hard to detect because a lot of it's not well monitored, and it's usually just not top of mind. And then vulnerabilities sadly do also exist in popular network security products. So sadly, sometimes these defenses can also become the front door that attackers let themselves in through. And just having a single point of failure is typically not the best way to go if you have other options. So advanced threats will find ways to get around firewalls. Life finds a way, right? So having that single point of failure is typically not going to be enough for your security posturing in an enterprise network. And this also kind of highlights why a lot of the attacks that I'm going to be demonstrating today are going to begin with network dominance. So we're going to begin with the idea that, hey, the attacker is somewhere in the network, or perhaps they've exploited another machine in the network. And now we're just going to talk a little bit about how we're going to move throughout whatever foothold they have to compromise their ESXi machine and talk about the threat that that poses. To harken back a little bit to the discussion on, why ESXi, something else that I want to highlight here is that MITRE, which is an organization I've already brought up a couple of times now, they maintain the attack framework, right? So basically, this large matrix that links a lot of the techniques that threat actors will use with common terminology and lets us kind of talk about them in an educated way. It's an important part of cybersecurity as an industry and how we talk about threats. And ESXi has been such a growing threat that when they released MITRE ATT&CK version 17 earlier this year, they actually included an entirely new matrix focused explicitly on ESXi. So this matrix is devoted simply to that one, including all of the TTPs, all of the tactics that we see leveraged against ESXi servers. This meant that a bunch of techniques, I think 34 of them, got adapted to ESXi, and then there were 4 unique techniques that got added specifically for ESXi that don't appear on the other ones. The reason I bring this up really is to show that the industry and particularly researchers in the industry are starting to take notice of the trends against ESXi. And this is something that will probably be followed eventually by compliance requirements. So this is something that we see in the next few years becoming only more important, not less important. I don't think this is going to be a flash in the pan, but rather just kind of a new normal when it comes to specifically ransomware attacks, but really any kind of attack against enterprise networks, because virtualization is just so prevalent. So let's get into our first exploit, though. This is going to be the fun part, I promise, of this presentation today, and hopefully the part that you all will remember and enjoy watching here. Let's talk about ESXi ARGs. So ESXi ARGs is a ransomware, both a ransomware sample, so a actual piece of ransomware, and a gang that was associated with it that was kind of named after it. It typically will leverage CVE 2021-21974 and then execute, some vulnerabilities that exist in, let's see, I think this is ESXi 6.7 and before, and then also some versions of 7.0. You can see some of that up here on the slide. What it tries to do at first is initiate an information leak over the SLP process and then do a memory corruption attack based on the information that's been leaked. And you're going to get to see all of that here in just a second. It does require port 427 over TCP or UDP. And it does get associated with, in that MITRE ATT&CK framework, T1637, but it also is just to call out one of the ones that wouldn't be specifically tied to ESXi. It's just a method of gaining that remote code execution. It will give us full access eventually, and we'll be able to see that here in a second. There are public POCs for this, I should also mention as well, which is a lot of what we're going to be using here today. All right, so let's jump right into it. So this is our ESXi host. This is a 6.7 server that we're looking at here. And we can take a quick look around and we can see a couple of the virtual machines that are associated with it. So we have Gandalf, Frodo, and Gimli. Those are going to be the ones that we're targeting here today. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that I have a netcat listener that's primed with a unaim a command. So this will just let us know when we've actually gained access to the host when we get that reverse shell. And then you'll see over here, we have our proof of concept Python code that we're about to run, and it's going to be targeting that ESXi server. Now, this will take a minute. And really what you're going to see is that it's going to send a bunch of connection attempts and a bunch of requests for information against port 427 running the SLP service on our vulnerable host. While it's running, what I want to do is I want to look at the actual code of the exploit that we're running, and you'll see, hey, look, here's the command that we're going to ask it to run in the end. It's essentially just going to result in a netcat shell, a shell attached to a netcat session that will be reaching back out to our attacker machine and then trying to give us that shell access once the exploit completes there. All right, so it's still running through, trying to leak some of that information. It's sending all of these service requests just to figure out where the interesting parts of the SLP service memory are. And once we get that back here in just a second, then we're going to get to see what it does next. It's actually, this SLP exploit specifically is one that that sometimes can also be a little bit temperamental. Now, this one's obviously pre-recorded. We got some of the information we needed here, just as I was talking about it. This is one that we do pre-recorded, but when I run this one live, it's actually only about a 50-50 shot that the exploit works. This is something that when it comes to actual software vulnerabilities is a pretty common case with a lot of them, is that they become a little bit unreliable. So this is one of the riskier ways that attackers can gain access. But oftentimes it does pay dividends. As you see over there on the left-hand side of the screen, that uname a command actually successfully completed. We can see that we're on an ESXi 6.7 host, which, that lines right up with what we thought was going to be vulnerable to this, right? And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to download my ESXi args malware, and then I'm going to attempt to run it. It's going to be pretty quick. I'm just hosting it over here on my attacker box. And you can see that it went through. We can see a couple of the files in both Frodo and Gimli are being called out by it right now. And let's just take a look at what happened to those files. And what we will see is that they have been encrypted. And the proof of that really for this kind of brief demo is just seeing the .args file extension there at the end of that. So if I was a system administrator and I came over here and I tried to restart Gandalf now, what you're going to see is that, hey, it can no longer find the VMDK file, or sorry, the VMX file in this particular case. Really, it could be any of the files that are associated with that VM. And if it can't find those, then it's going to take a whole. This is when my bad day as a system administrator begins, right? Is when I see that. When I see that it can't find some of the core files associated with the guest operating system because they've been encrypted. So if I was a system administrator suffering this kind of attack, this is the point where I would have to begin investigating, hey, what happened to my virtual machines? And I'm sure then I would find the ransom notes left behind and we would begin incident response. So bad day for an administrator. For me as an attacker, it's been a big success. So let's talk a little bit about kind of what the fallout of ESXi args has been. And what's happening today with some of these systems that are vulnerable to. I'm actually going to show you guys a Shodan search here on the next slide just to see how many of the ESXi systems that are vulnerable to this still exist in the wild. So in February of 2023, and again, this is just kind of citing information from a couple of years ago at this point, there were 18,000 vulnerable systems, and that was 2 years after the release of the patch that was associated with the ESXi args malware and the CVE mentioned earlier. And if you look today, then you will see that there are still over 20,000 publicly facing ESXi systems. Now, there may be multiple versions of these, but certainly some of them are still going to be those vulnerable versions. We've got highlighted down there on the bottom of this. You can see, hey, look, there's still one of those ESXi 6.7 version machines. So ESXi args is a nasty attack. There is a patch for it. But unfortunately, software vulnerabilities are still a problem. Even after patches have been released, because in the real world, patches don't always get applied when they should. In organizations that have the right amount of resources and the technical manpower to be able to make those patches happen, at the time that they release or shortly thereafter, this is less of a problem. But that's not the reality that many organizations are facing. And so we have to accept that many of these software vulnerabilities, despite being years old at this point, still exist in the wild and are still viable access methods for many attackers. So what can we do about this? Well, one is patch, right? That's just what we were talking about just a moment ago. Is we can patch our vulnerable software. That'll take care of the problem at its root. We can implement network segmentation, and this certainly will help. This certainly will help, though it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Any of those, anything that's really based on network security first. So looking at, say a firewall or just cordoning off different parts of the network, it is a great mitigation, but it is ultimately going to be circumnavigable to a highly motivated attacker that gains multiple footholds within a network. And then the other thing we can do for this particular exploit is we can disable the SLP. Service. We can disable the SLP service and we can disable the firewall rule that exists for it. And these two things will prevent attackers from being able to reach that service even on vulnerable machines. So those are some things you can do. The last addition I would make to this is you could also implement runtime security. So you could also add something like zero lock to that machine to help use things like virtual patching and or active alerting and ransomware detection to help protect against it. But we can talk more about that later. Okay, so let's move on to one of our other methods of gaining access to ESXi, which is lateral compromise. So we're actually going to dive right into a scattered spider attack on this one. So this was MGM Resorts. The breach occurred in 2023. This is a really famous one. So many of you have probably heard about it. You're probably more familiar with it. It has cost to date, and I think this number has actually gone up, but It has cost over $100 million, which I shouldn't probably laugh at, but you do just kind of have to look at the scale of some of these attacks and think, wow, this has come so far. Cyber attacks are now costing organizations in the hundreds of millions, and that's a pretty wild jump from where some of these things were, say 10 years ago. And ransomware has definitely proven to be financially effective, if nothing else. Oh, about 100-ish ESXi hypervisors were hit in this attack. And there are actually a lot of pending lawsuits that are still out there for the MGM attack. So the cost may go up still. $100 million or just north of $100 million, which is what we're seeing right now, may not end up being the total cost of this particular attack. Um, so what I want to do now is actually we'll break it down a little bit. And this is a complicated attack chain. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about every single step of this, but we'll make it simple and say that there was a lot of social engineering that was happening in the very beginning. So Scattered Spider had a particular target admin that they went after. They tricked them into doing a SIM swap, so they gained access to their cell phone basically. And this has actually been enabled even more by things like eSIMs, right? So it's now with many cell devices, not just cell phones, but with many cell devices, you can use data and software-based SIM cards rather than actual physical SIM cards, which they're secure, but it makes it even easier. It doesn't require physical access for attackers who have successfully targeted and socially engineered a victim into trusting them. So they used that access and used the data they were able to get out of that SIM card swap to call the IT help desk, basically, that the team at MGM was using. They were able to reset that MFA and then gain access to the cloud services. From that point, they gained access to the domain controller that was within the MGM environment. They did a memory dump, harvested some credentials from it, which took a little bit of time. But then from that point, once they had those credentials harvested from the domain controller, they were able to just simply walk in the front door of the ESXi environment. They logged into I think the vSphere service, and then enabled SSH, and then used the credentials that they had stolen from the domain controller to SSH into the ESXi environment. And once you've done that, you have root level access. It's just as simple as shutting down the VMs and launching the attack that you want to launch, right? So pretty straightforward. Now, something I want to talk about though too is that MGM is not asleep at the wheel, right? This is a good security team, and unfortunately, the human element is often very exploitable. This is something that so many organizations struggle with and kind of grapple with. How do we solve the problem of social engineering and phishing attacks and the human element? And it's a tough one. There's not a one size fits all solution. It's not something that's easily solvable, but I'm sure that's something that you all are familiar with. So yeah, I want to highlight that they're definitely not asleep at the wheel. They know what they're doing, and they still fell victim to an attack like this. And obviously, it's had a pretty heavy cost. I did mention that the way that this one happened is they harvested those credentials, they logged into the vSphere, the vCenter vSphere environment, and then from there we're able to go in and do admin actions on ESXi to enable SSH, which we're going to see in just a minute. But I just want to pull up this slide really quick for those who are perhaps less familiar with kind of the architecture of how this all works. The ESXi hosts running a bunch of VMs, and then all of those VMs in the ESXi hosts themselves are being managed by the vCenter server, which then an administrator would use the vSphere client to log into. So that's what we're going to be able to kind of see here in just a second. So yeah, without further ado, let's actually jump into the technical portion of this attack, which is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm actually hesitant to call this one too technical, but we are going to get to see kind of how this attack got laid out. So they logged into the vSphere environment, which we've already seen, and then we can take a little bit of a look around. We can look at some of the ESXi hosts that are already here, get whatever information we want. But in a more targeted sense, we're going to go into services. We're going to turn on SSH, because on most modern ESXi machines, SSH is disabled by default, but can be manually turned on like this. And then we'll take a look at some of the virtual machines that are being hosted here on this ESXi server. So we can see there's an Ubuntu machine and then another machine named Walter White. And now that we've opened up the front door, we're just going to walk right in. So we SSH'd into that ESXi host pretty quickly. We can take a look at VMFS volumes, where all of those virtual machines exist and their data stores there. We found Walter White. And now what we're going to do is we're going to run a living off the land attack. Now, I don't have enough time to break this down fully, but it's using only binaries that are already extant on this ESXi host. And you can see we've already encrypted the VMDK files associated with Walter White. So much like the last attack, what's going to end up happening here is we're going to try and turn it on, and we're going to see that operation failed. And it's because the VMX file, again, was not found. So we're seeing an alert and a failure very, very similar to the last, and that's because we were able to execute another ransomware attack. So this is very, very instructive of how Scattered Spider did the MGM attack. they were able to gain those creds, walk in the front door, and then do whatever they wanted. Now, in their case, I don't know if it was living off the land attack. In fact, I believe it wasn't. I believe they brought in foreign binaries, so they did have a ransomware sample that they were able to launch against the MGM server there. But in this is just an alternate method of doing the same thing. We could go back and grab the ESXi binary or one of the ransomware samples we're going to use here in a minute. They're all going to have roughly the same effect at the end of the day. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a twofer. I'm going to show actually one other method of lateral compromise using a different type of vulnerability. So in the last one, we exploited the human element, and in this one, actually, we probably would be doing something similar with a phishing campaign up front. But instead of simply walking in the front door over SSH, what we're going to do in this one is we're going to walk in the front door using an authentication bypass with the domain controller. So the requirements for this one is that the ESXi machine has to be a vulnerable version, and it also has to be joined to an ESXi host. Or sorry, the ESXi host must be joined to the domain controller itself. What it's going to do is if we have create and modify permissions on the domain controller, we can create an ESX admins group on that domain controller that does not exist on ESXi. And we can create users that do not exist on the ESXi host. But as long as the ESXi server itself sees that I'm coming in from the domain controller on a domain group that is named ESX admins, it will automatically give me root access. So this is a fun one. This is a very, very fun exploit, but we'll talk through it kind of as we go here. So you can see that I was trying to log in over VNC there with the Billie Jean account into the domain controller because somehow I've gained access to those credentials, right? We've already exploited the domain controller. Now it's just a question of how do we get to ESXi? And how we're going to do that is we're going to create the group that I just created, ESX admins. We're going to go ahead and edit it to add in my Billie Jean user that I'm already logged in as, that I already have the credentials for. We'll go ahead and apply those changes. And again, the thing that I want to highlight is that Billie Jean does not exist. That user does not exist on our ESXi host. But nonetheless, I'm going to go to our ESXi host's web UI and I'm going to try and log in with Billie Jean. And suddenly I am able to gain access to it. And this is only because it's a domain joined ESXi machine. And then there's the group ESX admins. I didn't even have to give that ESX admins group any kind of permissions. It's a new group. The only change that I made was making it, giving it a name, and adding Billie Jean to it. So from this point now, what I can do is I can create a new user. If I want to kind of have some level of persistence here on this ESXi host, I can create a new user. I'll name it administrator. I'll give it whatever password I want because I already have access to the ESXi host. And I can enable SSH like I did in the last instance. And now I can log in over SSH just using, domain controller access with a group that I don't even have permissions to modify. Once again, I can take a look at one of those virtual machines that's on that host. We are looking at Gandalf in this particular case. And then we're running the exact same living off the land attack just against that Gandalf virtual machine specifically instead of the Walter White one that we saw in the last example. So what you're going to see here is basically how this attack is working is it's looking at all the files that are associated with that virtual machine, and then it just pipes them through OpenSSL. OpenSSL is a quote unquote known good binary that's used for a lot of cryptographic functions that are legitimate. But what you can see is I've been able to use it here to encrypt all of the files associated with the Gandalf virtual machine. We are seeing attackers starting to move to living off the land attacks like this, where they're not bringing in foreign binaries because it's a little bit quieter. But again, this is just to highlight that there's all kinds of ways to move laterally within an environment once you've gained a little bit of a foothold. So these are just two examples, right? We either gain access to the vSphere environment directly, or hey, we can use vulnerabilities that exist with the ESX admin groups in the domain controller. There will be more vulnerabilities like these in the future. And that's really what I want to highlight is that these are the ones from the last couple of years, right? These are the ones that we have seen, observed in just the last 2 years that attackers have used, but there will be more. Other things are going to happen that are similar to this that we can't necessarily predict, but we can predict that they're going to exist and they're going to be maybe similar to these, giving us that lateral movement from one part of the network into our ESXi hosts. So the things we can do, we can patch, we can segment the network. This is going to sound very, very similar to one of our earlier attacks, and we can apply runtime protection. And again, that's not really been something that we could recommend until very, very recently with ZeroLock, right? So ZeroLock is pretty much the only runtime protection solution currently for ESXi. And and so this is, that's kind of our only recommendation we could make there, other than just patching and network segmentation, which in many instances prove to not be enough. Okay, so let's jump into what is going to be our last attack vector. We're going to talk a little bit about the MITRE breach that happened here as well. So MITRE is another really top-notch organization. We've got a lot of respect for them, and they know what they're doing. In fact, you'll remember that earlier in the presentation we talked about the MITRE attack framework version 17 that they produce. So this is the organization that knows a lot about cybersecurity, but unfortunately, even very competent organizations are being successfully targeted because of some of these kind of glaring vulnerabilities that people just have not been paying attention to. One of the things that happened in the MITRE breach in 2024 was that the attackers used a malicious VIB. Now, again, in this crowd at a VMUG event, I'm sure that a VIB is going to be a pretty known entity to you guys. But I will do a little bit of explaining about how this specifically is working in this attack as we go along here. They used that VIB to gain persistence. They had to tamper with the acceptance level a little bit, which they should not have been able to do. And we're going to focus on how they were able to do that. But this one I'm actually going to break down in a couple of different phases. So the first one that we're going to watch is just trying to bring across just a binary that has on a machine that has secure boot enabled. So you see that I was able to move that binary over using SCP, but with secure boot enabled, running it is not going to be permitted, right? So ESXi will recognize this as a foreign binary, and it will say, hey, I haven't seen this before. I'm gonna deny execution on it, right? So as an attacker, this is a problem that I have to circumnavigate, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a VIB to solve this problem. So a VIB, what are they, and what is this? What are we looking at with this descriptor.xml file? So VIBs are essentially glorified archives, right? And the descriptor file is just what we use to kind of describe what exactly is in that archive and what ESXi needs to do with it. The ESXi system file system rather, is volatile, and it resets most of its file system at every boot. So things are not going to be persistent, but an installed VIB is unpacked every time at boot. So that VIB package that we do the installation with, it gets saved as part of the state of the ESXi host, and then it makes some changes to note to itself that the next time that it boots, it needs to unpack that VIB again, and it needs to ensure that it's always there in the file system. So this is a great way to gain persistence on a volatile file system like ESXi. And this descriptor is not actually the one that we're going to be using. It's just kind of reflective of what they look like in general. All right, so we're going to try this now. We're going to make a custom VIB, and we're going to bring it in, and we're going to see if there's any other issues that we run into. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to SCP that malware VIB that you see there at the top of the screen, and then we're going to SSH into the host. Okay, so we've gained access. Now we're just going to try and install it using an ESXi command. So ESXi software VIB install, and we see that there's a validation error. Now this is a big problem, right? There's a validation error. We can't validate the content. Well, actually, as you can see, all I really have to do is add a TAC F, and we're able to circumnavigate the extensibility check thing. So that's not really, it's kind of a non-issue, but this next part is an issue. We can see that the acceptance level is set to community, which is not of this VIB, right? So this VIB is a community VIB. It's one that I just created as Joe Schmo. It's not signed by VMware or anyone that they've approved. So let's try and reset that acceptance level. With secure boot enabled, we cannot change the acceptance level to community. So here we seem to have hit another wall as the attacker, right? We've got our malicious VIB, but we can't actually install it because the administrator here has secure boot enabled on this ESXi host. Is there any way around this? Well, we're going to do a little bit of research and find out. So a big shout out to Austin Gady and Kaushik Lathia over here at Vali Cyber for doing some of the research that went into figuring out how to get this attack chain to work. But if we do a little bit of digging into some of the Python scripts that are used to manage VIB installation, it appears that there may actually be a way for us to get around this acceptance level problem. We can call some of the native functions that are inside the VMware provided host image update scripts, and we should be able to take a custom acceptance level file and get it to be applied. So we're going to try that. We're going to do it all at once. So we're going to jump back in where we were at. We can see that we're at a partner supported level of acceptance. So we're not at community supported. That's not where we're at. So if we have our community signed VIB, then we shouldn't be able to install it. But that command that I just ran, that, creating a community supported acceptance.json and then going into config store cli and doing the config current set command that we have and giving it that acceptance.json actually allowed us to change to community supported. So although this is not a well documented method, it actually is possible even in secure boot on systems that are running ESXi. And now when I try to install the VIB with that TAC F, we can see that actually I was able to successfully do it. No reboot is required, and ESXi is reporting that it was successfully installed. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and see if it actually ran, and it did. So we had the Akira ransomware is what we were running in this particular instance. So it was a custom ransomware sample that we brought in. And we can see that, hey, our Gimli virtual machine at the very least got hit with it as soon as that VIB was installed. This is a way of gaining persistence. It's also a method of running ransomware. If you can get a VIB to actually install on an ESXi host, then you're going to be able to get a VIB to do anything that you want it to do, whether just any kind of remote code execution. So whether that's opening up a backdoor, which we've seen many threat actors do using malicious VIBs on ESXi, or running a ransomware attack like this. So this is, for me as the attacker, a pretty good day. Looks like we had some pretty good success there. So how do we defend ourselves against this one? Well, hey, I'm going to start sounding like a broken record here, but the answers are going to be patching, network segmentation, and runtime protection, right? I would actually add one other thing to this, which is taking a really, really good hard look at exactly what kind of configuration you currently have on ESXi. And again, that runtime protection really hasn't been a thing until ZeroLock, which is really what we're going to talk about now. So mentioned at the top that I lead the threat intelligence team at Vali Cyber, and the product that we produce is ZeroLock. It essentially provides a layered defense approach to runtime protection on ESXi hosts and also on Linux. But we're talking about Hypervisor here today. The graphic that you see on this slide, right, is our kind of our onion of protection. And beginning at the outside, we can have SSH multi-factor authentication. So threat actors like Scattered Spider, we know that they're using techniques where they just walk in the front door. They get on, they gain access in some way, whether to vSphere or to the host directly. They enable SSH, and then they just walk right in. It's unfortunately a pretty common technique that we see across the board in these attacks. SSH multi-factor authentication adds just an extra layer of security to each time that someone attempts to actually log in using SSH. It requires them then to provide a time-based token, which, unless the attacker has also stolen someone's physical smartphone or gained access to all the rest of their accounts, they're not going to be able to circumnavigate. They would just have to guess at that time-based token. So although, again, not a one-size-fits-all solution, it's a really, really good mitigation for a lot of the attacks that we've seen. Application filtering is essentially just the ability to look at all of the executables on that ESXi host and say, hey, this is a new and foreign one, and I want to disallow it. And where we really get into a lot of the good secret sauce of ZeroLock is in lockdown rules, virtual patching, and AI behavioral detection, where we can have really, really fine-grained control of the specific behaviors that are executed on ESXi. This is a complex topic that I could talk about for a long time, and I often do. But there's a lot of configurability for ZeroLock to protect against the behaviors that are most commonly malicious on ESXi hosts, including a lot of the things we've seen today, like executing ESXi commands, VIB installation, deploying ransomware, even living off the land ransomware that doesn't use foreign binaries. All of those things can be detected by ZeroLock. And then you can also see on the slide here, we talk a little bit about some of the overhead for ZeroLock, the fact that we do in fact have a signed VIB. So that problem that you saw with the community VIB that we tried to execute our ransomware with doesn't apply to the things that we do. We work hand in hand with VMware to ensure that our product meets their standards and that they're okay with it being deployed. And so all of our agents do deploy as signed VIBs with VMware, removing a lot of those installation headaches. And the MITRE attack framework that we talked about earlier, that version 17 that was released in April of this year, we were very happy to be able to say that ZeroLock actually covers 100% of the TTPs when correctly configured. We're able to address everything that gets brought in, or that gets addressed or noted, annotated by that MITRE attack framework version 17. Later we can show other demos of ZeroLock in action. You can find those on our website as well. But the big thing here today is just that I want to highlight for everybody that ESXi is very vulnerable. That's kind of the point of showing a lot of these attack chains. is bringing awareness to the number of attacks and the types of attacks that are really being executed against ESXi. I think the security research realm is starting to take note of this, and I think a lot of administrators and end users are also starting to take note of this. But unfortunately, for many organizations, there's still a huge gap between actually protecting their system and having a good understanding of what it takes to protect an ESXi host, and actually being able to deploy those capabilities. They're severely underanalyzed by security professionals, though that is starting to change. And it's traditionally been an ignored platform, but we really can't afford to let that happen anymore. When we see attacks like the MGM one that are costing Scattered Spider specifically in MGM's case, costing these organizations over $100 million in lost business or downtime or in damage, it's just really something that we can't afford to continue to neglect as concerned ESXi users. And runtime security is an imperative part of this, right? We can't do what we need to do on ESXi without using some kind of runtime security to watch things as they happen. So yeah, I'd encourage you, if you have a second, take a look. You can use one of these QR codes to jump onto Shodan. Take a look and see if your hypervisors are on there. Hopefully they're not. I'm sure they aren't for anyone who's listening today to this presentation. Um, but take a look and make sure. And even if they're not on there, take a look at how many are, right? How many of these vSphere, vCenter, ESXi servers are out there and that are exposed and that do present a very large attack surface to motivated threat actors. I really appreciate you guys sticking with us here today. We are a VMware Technology Alliance partner. I'll reiterate that that's part of what allows us to have our signed VIB. I hope this has been educational. I hope everyone stays safe. And honestly, I'd be happy to try and take any questions now from anyone listening if we've got any in particular.
Oh, thank you so much, Nathan. That was fantastic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Megan Howard. I'm the VP of Marketing for Vali Cyber, and I've been here in the background kind of answering some of your all's questions, but there were also some great ones that I wanted to present to Nathan because I thought it would be good discussion for the group. Before we dive in, though, there are two little housekeeping points that I'd love to make sure everybody is aware of. One of which is that we've got people were asking if this webinar will be sent out. Indeed, VMware will be sure to send out this webinar to all registrants, so don't worry about that. Another point I wanted to make sure folks knew about, it's right around the corner, VMware Explore, guys. We are going to be there. If you guys would like to meet with us, learn more about Zero Lock, we will absolutely be around. So don't hesitate to reach out. So without further ado, let's dive in. So we have a question from Andrew, which was asking if there's exploited vulnerabilities in later versions of ESXi, like 8 or 9. Sure. And I just, it's a great point of discussion for the group. The answer is yes, but I'll hand it over to you at that point, Nathan, and dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Megan. So there's two parts to this question, right? Are there vulnerabilities and have they been exploited? I think that's kind of the two big things for Andrew for your question there. Yeah, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is some of them have not necessarily been exploited in the wild, like the vulnerabilities that we've seen in recent months, right? Say the CVE 22224 ones from March, or the ones from what is it, from Pwn to Own that happened earlier this year. Those could be counted as exploited, right? There is a proof of concept out there. Am I aware of an 8.0 host or later that has been hit by one of those CVEs? I'm not personally aware of it, but I think it's instructive that they exist, and that those machines are still being hit, right? So think about all the attacks that have happened in the last couple of years, regardless of whether or not there's a specific software vulnerability that exists against 8.0 or 8.x, whatever, or any of the new 9.x machines. They're certainly still under attack, right? So a lot of ransomware still gets leveraged against them, like we see in the instance of like MGM, or any of the more recent ones like Marks and Spencer or anything like that. So do they still get hit? Yes. Am I aware of specific software vulnerabilities that have been actively exploited by ransomware actors against those versions? I can't say confidently that I 100% do, but I don't think the threat isn't there because of that. Definitely still there.
Yeah, they're always poking holes.
Yep.
Let's see. We've got another question from Joshua. He says, something is bothering me. There was an attack competition, a vulnerability was found, and it was immediately disclosed to the public before VMware was made aware of it and given the opportunity to patch. Are these actual black hat operators, or was VMware given the chance to respond in a timely manner but failed? I don't know the answer to that one. I wasn't sure if you did.
Yeah, I can provide. I mean, I don't work at, I wasn't at Pwn to Own, and I don't work at VMware, so I'm not sure exactly what was disclosed to everybody, but I do know that
You
the
mean you're
competition.
not an active criminal hacker?
I know, hard to believe, right? Not anymore. The answer is, I see it though, is this. So at Pwn to Own, they do disclose to the software owners, right? So that's part of the point of the competition, is that security researchers can come, show off, get a little bit of income out of it, and they get to also increase the security of the product. So those vulnerabilities were disclosed to Broadcom and VMware. Because at least I'm assuming, right? I am assuming because I'm sure that they were there. They were at Pwn to Own, and that's part of the point of the competition. Those vulnerabilities that we're talking about from May of this year, and that were released as CVEs in July, they were. And in fact, there was a patch for them. So I have to imagine that they were disclosed to them. The thing that we really want to talk about, though, is that there was a 2-month gap, right? So there was a 2-month gap between that being discovered and disclosed to VMware. So that's about how long the patch time took, at least in those instances. That may not hold across the board, but it did for those ones. So they are being disclosed. This is not always the case, right? I can't speak confidently about every single vulnerability that has always existed. The ones that we like to see are the ones like Pwn to Own, right? Because that means, hey, this is a quote unquote good guy, a security researcher who's out here actually disclosing and doing things the right way. That does not always happen. So vulnerabilities like the SLP exploit were used in the wild for months, if not, well, actually still today, years, right? They were used really actively for months, and then still can be exploited today against vulnerable systems. So I think that's kind of getting to your question. Were they made aware of it and given the opportunity to patch? Yes, they were. Does that mean that there weren't others who, when they figured out this was a thing? So there's a lot of nuance to this conversation. There was a lot of rumors in the 2 months between those two things where people realized there was a vulnerability that was valid. That gives people a lot more motivation to go out and find it. It was, I believe, found within that intervening 2 months, and some POCs were being worked on at the time. But to address your question, they were given an opportunity to patch. The question is just, how long does that take? So sorry, long-winded answer to that question, but hopefully it was good.
Yeah, all good. We have another question, which is, one of the big points in the article is talking about the techniques used by Scattered Spider is the use of external identity trust, AD. If the vCenter infrastructure doesn't give administrative access to the AD accounts, doesn't this negate a big part of the problem?
Sure. Yeah, I would say so. I would say that would negate a big part of that specific problem, right? With that one. The question is, what other things does it not negate? Where else are they coming in? Who does have the creds for those vSphere accounts, right? So remember that the way that Scattered Spider typically gains access to AD, or to the the domain controller, to whatever it is they gain access to up front, is social engineering. So even if it's not that is their favorite technique, is come in that way, do AD stuff, and then come in otherwise. I think that they've actually used other techniques in the past, though, like other I'll have to look into that and probably try and get you a better answer on it too. But the end point here is that the technique itself is not limited to AD, right? So who does have the creds for the ESXi host? Somebody does. And at the end of the day, what they were really doing was attacking the human. So what we have to do is we have to be able to lock down the endpoint, because they're going to get the creds one way or another, whether it's through something as simple and inane as password guessing, which is unlikely, but possible, or all the way up through, dumping the domain controller memory, and then cracking password hashes, or just taking them directly from AD. There's a lot of ways to skin that cat. So yes, I would say that would mitigate it if you're not using vCenter infrastructure, joined to an Active Directory domain. Sure, yeah, that would prevent that particular ingress method. But what other ingress methods are not being mitigated in that case? So a human is probably still in the loop somewhere.
Yeah, fair enough. We've got some follow-up questions regarding more about Zero Lock. And so before we
Yeah.
transition to those, I did just want to note for folks who didn't realize it, I did put in the webinar chat a link to our 5-minute demo of Zero Lock. If you would like to see that, it's available on our website. We've got a question, which is, do you have anything that works on dark sites? Chris, if you're asking about, do we have a a video that we can send you. I can definitely, I'm sure we can find something for you. If you're asking whether Zero Lock can work kind of in on-prem situations, our answer is yes. And I'll let Nathan expand on that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So, if you want to clarify the question a little bit, Chris, too, I think we'd be happy if we're going down the wrong direction here. But what Megan is getting to here is, like air-gapped networks and the like. Zero Lock is not dependent on cloud infrastructure. So it will work wherever it is deployed. Once it's configured, it's set and forget if you want it to be, or you can do active monitoring using the Zero Lock server. So essentially how this works is our deployment model uses a centralized Zero Lock server that runs on a Linux machine. We have OVAs for this. It's going to be deployed on ESXi or vSphere environments pretty easy. And then you take agents and deploy them to the actual host that you're trying to protect. Now, we mentioned in the presentation that those are really, really low overhead. So this is typically less than 5% of one core of an ESXi host CPU. And then less than about 50 megabytes of memory per host is usually what we see, just to give you kind of rough numbers. Those vary depending on performance and types of machines and that kind of stuff, but that's typically what we see. So very low overhead. And then, yeah, once it's running, we don't have any like cloud callbacks. We're not running. Everything happens on node once configured. So all of the protections that we mentioned, that SSH, MFA, lockdown rules, the ransomware protection, all of that happens on node. So it could be completely cut off from the network after being configured. It could be a satellite, moving through space with no connection to any ground station or any other satellite or anything like that. And Zero Lock would still be running the same way and protecting against the same things like ransomware attacks or anything that lockdown rules are configured for, or, ESXi commands that are malicious, that kind of stuff. Just as an example. Hopefully that's kind of what you were getting at. But if not, please let us know, and I'm happy to try and take another stab at that.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Pete was asking, are there any Nutanix hypervisor demos? I don't
Oh, yeah,
believe
good. Yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead.
go for it. Yeah.
I don't think that we have any pre-recorded Nutanix
I don't
demos.
think
It
we do.
is something that we're happy to talk through, and we do support Nutanix. We've just seen so much. ESXi has been the big part of interest, and especially at a VMUG event, we're talking about ESXi the most. But if you're interested in Nutanix demos or talking about our Nutanix capabilities, please reach out. Something that we're happy to talk about. I don't know if we have a pre-recorded one for Nutanix. Maybe that's something we should work on though, because if there's enough
To look
interest.
back through our library. Yeah, it's a great point. Thanks, Pete. Thank you for bringing that up. We've got a question. Oh, you're going to love this one. Okay, so Joshua is asking, what is the method of maintaining Zero Lock currency with the new attacks coming through?
Yeah, that's good. So I think this is part of what my team does. So it was mentioned that I lead the threat intelligence team at Zero Lock. So a lot of what we do is we do updates to, well, we search for the things that need to be updated. So trying to keep track of new threats as they come along, and what's being leveraged against ESXi hosts and the like. A lot of how the update process looks is we periodically produce new lockdown rules, and that's typically the only. Well, there's new server updates if you want them, but those are much less frequent and much less necessary for security reasons. Usually, it's just slight performance upgrades and the like. Maybe sometimes like an occasional capability upgrade. But for the most part, what we do is we create new lockdown rules for specific tactics, techniques, and procedures that we see being used in the wild. And this process is pretty simple. We do advisories to our customers, and then we will also distribute just these little JSON files full of those lockdown rules. We send it to you, or if we're hosting your instance, we can do it ourselves. We're happy to do that if it's one that you want us to host. But if you're hosting yourself, we send you the JSON file, and then it's basically 2 clicks in our UI, the Zero Lock server UI, to get those rules uploaded, and then you can just decide which ones you actually want applied to your environment. If they're part of our recommended sets, those can be applied automatically once you upload them. But that's what the basic process looks like. We try and produce new rules about once a quarter, but we do that far more often for severe vulnerabilities. So, for instance, when those CVEs came out last month, we actually had everything in place already to protect against those because we had a pretty good grasp on kind of from a behavioral perspective what they would look like on an ESXi host. So we just sent a notice to customers talking about that and what they would need to do to be protected if they want to be. And that it's pretty quick turnaround. We try and get that done really fast within about 48 hours for most critical vulnerabilities that are released against ESXi.
Yep. Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah.
One more question regarding Zero Lock, which is Jim's asking, what are the storage costs?
The storage costs. Let me think about
So
that.
I think we're thinking about well, it's a good question. Jim, if
It is
we're
a good
asking,
question.
yeah. If
So
we're thinking about
the only storage cost I can really think of associated with this on protected endpoints, there really shouldn't be any storage costs. I mean, I'd have to look at how big our VIB is. On most, I'll say this, on most ESXi hosts, it's probably going to be pretty negligible. I mean, we're not talking more than 50 megabytes probably of actual storage usage on any particular ESXi host. Probably the more interesting question in terms of storage is how big is our OVA? And you know what? Sadly, I actually don't have that number in front of me, but I could figure it out for you really quick. I'll say this. Storage has not necessarily been a concern that we've really seen encountered by anyone that has tried the product or who's any of our customers. We try and keep things pretty small. It's a pretty lightweight OVA that we use for our server. I could find you an exact number on that if you're really interested, but it's not going to be big. Our storage costs are not high. Yes, I apologize for not being prepared to answer that one really specifically though.
Yep, no worries. It's so yeah, we've got essentially what we say is you need kind of 50 megs of memory and then 100 megs of disk space.
Sure.
If you are doing on-prem, then we suggest 16 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of disk space.
There you go. I'd say that's your answer. Yeah. I think that's going to be probably as close as we have to official numbers. Those are also going to be overestimates for sure.
Yeah.
I will say that I will say
build in some buffer there just
looking at ESXi and zero lock systems running in practice, they don't use that much, but those are going to be good numbers to ensure that your environment can run zero lock for sure.
We've got a question from Wolfgang, which is there a known vulnerability to gain access from a VMware VM? Let's say a Windows or Linux web server, which is directly connected to the internet to the ESXi host. Breakout from a VM to the host.
Yeah. All of those CVEs that we just talked about, the ones that I mentioned that were disclosed this year, I shouldn't say all, because actually I think there was one or two that were slightly different in the latest grip of them from July. All of those were focused on VM escape. Every single one of them. So CVE 22224, 22225, and 22226 from March of this year is a chain of exploits that can be used to actually escape the virtual machine. Now, I do notice that there is a distinction in your question, though. You asked if there's a known exploit. To my knowledge, there is still no public proof of concept for these. But I believe that there are private exploits that do exist for these. Yes, for both. I think certainly for the pwn to own chain. The pwn to own chain was the same thing. So the one that happened in May and then was patched in July. They were able to successfully execute a proof of concept of that exploit at pwn to own to prove that it worked. So is there an exploit? Yes, 100%. Is there a public one that's like a public proof of concept? I don't believe so. I don't believe that there's one that you can just go download off GitHub, but there's 100% an exploit that exists for those vulnerabilities that does do virtual machine escape on ESXi. Yes.
Thank you, Nathan. Let's see. There's I think that's kind of all the questions that we have gotten. So thank you so much for the time. I did just want to mention to folks, if you enjoyed this presentation, if you're looking for ways to stay up to date on threats, we do have what we call our weekly threat roundup. And this is a newsletter that we send out every Friday, just with the latest articles, issues that we know about. And we just want you to stay informed and have the tools that you need to keep your environment protected. So I just put the link in the chat for that submission form. This is not a sales tool at all. This is just something that we use strictly to help folks stay in the know. So I think that's all we've got for today. Nathan, thank you so much for the time. This was fantastic. And we will hand things back over to you, Tristan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Megan and Nathan. That was awesome. Just a reminder, I know we saw some questions in the chat. This session was recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube as well as sent out to all of you who registered. So you will receive this presentation via email. Once the Zoom ends, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. Please fill out this survey. This helps us provide you fresh, relevant content in future webcasts. So everyone take care. Thank you for joining.
Thanks so much, guys.